Picture the scene. A chamber lit by torches, their smoke curling against damp stone, and in the middle of it a girl barely 14. Blanche of Navarre stands exposed, her thin frame trembling as hands not her own explore what should have been sacred. The Duchess of Bedford watches without pity, while midwives bend close, prodding and peering as though she were no more than livestock. Every breath Blanche takes feels stolen, every second stretched into eternity, because she knows her entire future now depends on what these women decide to say. 13 years she had been bound to Henry IV of Navarre, 13 years of a marriage without consummation. Whispers swirled in the corridors of power. Was the king incapable, or was Blanche somehow tainted? Those whispers had sharpened into knives, and this night they cut into her body. The so-called virginity test was meant to settle doubts, but in truth it was nothing more than humiliation paraded as justice. Imagine it, the hymen, a fragile piece of flesh, treated as the measure of queens, dynasties, and entire kingdoms. A fall from a horse, a childhood accident. Even the simple passage of time could betray her, yet none of that mattered. To those judging, she was not a girl but a vessel, a piece of political property, her worth pinned to a verdict whispered in that freezing chamber. This was the reality of queenship in medieval Europe. Thrones rested not only on steel and blood, but on the most intimate parts of a woman's body. And Blanche's ordeal was only the beginning. Tell me, if it were you beneath those torchlights, stripped and judged, could you keep your head high, or would fear break you first? Virginity was more than a private matter in medieval Europe. It was currency, proof, and weapon all at once. Inheritance meant everything, and the only way to guarantee the legitimacy of heirs was to bind men to women who had never known another. A queen's body became the seal of dynasties, her innocence a contract signed in flesh. That is why examinations like Blanche's were not rare cruelties, but expected rituals, legitimized by church, court, and crown. The simplest method was brutal in its obviousness: inspect the hymen. Yet superstition and fear drove people further into absurdity. Consider the sieve test. A young woman handed a kitchen tool with holes, commanded to carry water in it. If she failed, she was considered leaky, a metaphor for lost chastity. Imagine the humiliation of noble daughters desperately trying to hold back water under the gaze of men who measured their worth by the dripping of a household object. Even stranger were the urine tests. Medieval physicians believed purity left traces in liquid, claiming a virgin's urine sparkled white or clear, and that her way of relieving herself, slower, with a delicate hiss, could reveal untouched innocence. Picture the degradation: royal ladies, heirs to kingdoms, forced to urinate before male physicians who claimed to hear virtue in the sound of water hitting a chamber pot. And still, it did not end there. Religious writers suggested occult methods, charms, prayers, even magnets placed under pillows, said to expose adulterous wives through sudden visions. Such ideas blurred the line between medicine and superstition, but all had one purpose: to keep women's sexuality under constant suspicion and control. What do you think? Were these people blinded by ignorance, or did they invent these humiliations simply to keep women powerless? If the early methods seemed absurd, what came next was far more cruel. Imagine a young bride seated on a stool, a cloak thrown over her head, while smoke and acrid fumes filled the space beneath. This was fumigation, a trial by suffocation. The belief was that if the smoke traveled through her body and escaped through her mouth or nose, she was pure. If not, she was deemed corrupted. What dignity could remain when a woman's chastity was measured by choking on burning herbs? Other practices blurred the line between medicine and superstition. Magnets, believed to reveal hidden sins, were placed under pillows or near the body. If a woman shifted uneasily, if she twitched in her sleep, the conclusion was simple: she was guilty. It sounds laughable now, but for them, it was deadly serious. A queen could lose her crown, a girl could lose her life. And then came the role of midwives, women entrusted with both birth and examination. Some pitied their subjects and quietly lied, claiming they found the girl untouched. Others were merciless, determined to be accurate, even if it meant condemning another woman to disgrace. Solidarity could save, but betrayal was always a breath away. Each new method carried the same message. A woman's body was not her own. Her honor was subjected to smoke, magnets, and the scrutiny of eyes that saw her not as human, but as evidence. And while these rituals may seem grotesque, ask yourself, were they truly about truth or simply about control? Would you place your fate in the hands of such cruel superstition? The price of failure was never just shame, it was ruin. One failed test could mean banishment, divorce, or even death, and for queens the stakes were far greater. A single accusation could shatter alliances, trigger wars, and destroy dynasties. Blanche of Navarre learned this when her virginity, rather than her loyalty or dignity, became the currency of her worth. Though she survived her trial, the years of humiliation had already marked her life beyond repair. But hers was only one story. Consider Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess who became Queen of England. Married first to Prince Arthur, she was widowed young. When Henry VIII took her as his bride, their union was meant to bind two kingdoms. Yet years later, desperate for a male heir and driven by desire for Anne Boleyn, Henry turned on Catherine. He claimed their marriage was invalid because she had not entered it as a virgin. Imagine the cruelty. A queen questioned not for her wisdom or devotion, but for the state of her body decades earlier. The consequences were catastrophic. What began as a personal obsession unraveled the very fabric of England. Henry's demand for annulment severed ties with Rome, birthed the English Reformation, and plunged his realm into religious upheaval. And at the center of it all was Catherine, forced to defend her honor before church courts, her body dissected not by knives, but by words. This was the grim reality. The supposed truth of a woman's flesh outweighed treaties, faith, and even peace itself. A question for you. Can you imagine carrying the burden of a kingdom's fate in your own body, knowing that one whisper about your past could ignite a war? Even the bravest were not spared. Joan of Arc, the peasant girl who led armies and turned the tide of war, found her body subjected to the same humiliating trials as queens. Captured and brought before her judges, she was stripped, examined, and prodded, not to prove her courage or her divine mission, but her virginity. To them, her visions and victories meant nothing unless her body could be certified untouched. For the English, Joan's chastity was the key to discrediting her. If she were a virgin, then perhaps she truly was chosen by God. But if they could prove otherwise, she would be exposed as a fraud, her victories rewritten as witchcraft, her defiance punished as sin. And so the men who had once trembled before her armies now stood over her with cold hands and colder eyes, searching her flesh for a reason to burn her. Imagine the irony. A girl who had faced blades, fire, and the chaos of battle without flinching was forced into silence while strangers judged the secret parts of her body. Her armor had made her untouchable on the field, but here, in a cell, it could not protect her. This examination was as much a weapon as any sword, meant to strip away her sanctity, to turn her into a spectacle of shame. And yet, Joan endured. The records confirm what her enemies dreaded. She was indeed a virgin. But that truth did not save her. Condemned for her faith and her defiance, she was burned anyway. Her body proved pure, yet they destroyed it all the same. Tell me, does that not show the real purpose of these tests? Were they ever about truth or only about power? Even Joan of Arc, the girl who had lifted France from despair and stood before kings as God's chosen, was not spared the humiliations that defined medieval womanhood. Before she was condemned to flames, she was stripped of armor, stripped of dignity, and forced to submit to the same degrading procedure as any royal bride. In the presence of the Duchess of Bedford and her ladies, her body was inspected as if divine authority could be measured by skin and blood. For men who feared her visions, her strength, her defiance, it was not enough to brand her a heretic. They needed to reduce her to the one thing society understood: a virgin or not. And so, while France celebrated her as a savior, Joan lay trembling under hands that prodded and judged. It happened more than once. Midwives declared her intact, only for others to be summoned to repeat the test, as though heaven itself had to be confirmed by mortal fingers. Her courage on the battlefield, her victory at Orléans, Her unshakable faith, none of it mattered. What mattered was whether a membrane hidden inside her body could remain unbroken. Virgins, they said, were less vulnerable to the devil, and so the question of Joan's worth was reduced to the state of her flesh. Picture that for a moment. A warrior who stared down soldiers and cannons was reduced to lying silent while her persecutors searched for signs of purity. And I want to ask you, if you had stood among her judges, would you have believed her visions without demanding such proof? Or would you, like them, have insisted that truth could only be found between a girl's legs? Faced with a system designed to strip them of dignity, many women chose not to submit quietly. They learned to fight back, not with swords or armies, but with cunning. Manuals from the Middle Ages describe methods that today sound desperate, even grotesque. One involved leeches. A bride, on the eve of her wedding, would place one on her most intimate flesh so that it would draw blood and leave a small crust. On the wedding night, the bleeding could be passed off as proof of untouched purity. Imagine the pain, wounding yourself deliberately, not for survival on the battlefield, but to trick an audience waiting outside your chamber. And yet, for many, this pain was preferable to the shame or death that followed a failed test. Others turned to more theatrical solutions. Chicken blood hidden in jewelry, spilled onto sheets under the cover of darkness, could convince a crowd that the bride had bled naturally. Some planned weddings during menstruation, others even arranged for a substitute to take their place in the bedchamber. Think about the level of planning and fear that drove such schemes. A family conspiring, servants involved, all to satisfy a tradition that reduced a woman's worth to stains on linen. There were even primitive recipes for tightening the body with mixtures of herbs and egg whites, inserted at great risk. The ingenuity was remarkable, but so was the desperation that produced it. And let me ask you, what would you have done in their place? Would you have dared to risk discovery and harsher punishment by faking evidence? Or would you have trusted your fate to the hands of strangers, knowing that a single word from them could condemn you forever? The wedding night, in theory, should have been the most private moment between two people. In medieval Europe, it became something else entirely. A public test staged for politics and power. The consummation of a marriage was rarely just between husband and wife. Servants lingered outside the chamber, waiting for evidence. Courtiers speculated, and in the morning the sheets told the story, or at least they were supposed to. Bloodstains were snatched from the bed and paraded as proof of the bride's untouched virtue. Sometimes these sheets were preserved like relics, or even sent abroad as political confirmation that a royal marriage had been successfully sealed. What could have been a moment of intimacy was transformed into a grotesque performance, with the woman's body at its center. The absurdity lies in the fact that biology never cooperated with these expectations. Many women, untouched before their marriage, would not bleed at all. Others, who had never known a man, could lose their hymen through riding, labor, or exercise long before their wedding night. But none of this mattered. What mattered was the spectacle, the satisfaction of a tradition that valued a bloodstain more than truth. In Armenia, the ritual became known as the red apple, while in Georgia and among Azerbaijani communities, the blood ceremony was incorporated into the very structure of marriage. These customs were not isolated. They echoed across cultures, reinforcing the same idea, that a woman's honor belonged not to her, but to her family, her husband, and the court that claimed ownership of her fate. So tell me, if you had been in that chamber with the weight of a dynasty pressing down on you, would you have prayed for blood or prayed for escape? If virginity was a private condition, in royal courts it became a weapon sharper than any blade. The body of a queen could decide the fate of nations, and her sexual history was treated as evidence in political battles. Few stories illustrate this better than that of Catherine of Aragon. Married first to Prince Arthur of England, she was widowed within months. When the time came for her to wed his younger brother, Henry, questions of her purity became questions of law, theology, and empire. Had her first marriage been consummated? If she was no longer a virgin, her union with Henry might be invalid in the eyes of God. The court demanded an answer, not because of morality, but because England's alliance with Spain depended on it. Years later, when Henry VIII sought to rid himself of Catherine in favor of Anne Boleyn, the same question was revived with new venom. Suddenly, Catherine's past was dissected again, her body used as evidence in a campaign for annulment. This was not just about love or lust, it was about succession, wealth, and the control of kingdoms. Henry needed a son, and if Catherine could be declared impure from the start, then their marriage could be erased as though it had never existed. What began as a humiliating test of a teenage girl became a lifelong weapon turned against her, reshaping the destiny of England. And here lies the darker truth. Women's bodies were not only controlled by men, they were turned into battlegrounds for international diplomacy. Ask yourself, if the legitimacy of your country's throne depended on the condition of your body, how would you have endured such scrutiny? Could you bear to know that your most intimate secrets were debated in council chambers and echoed in treaties across Europe? For those who passed the ordeal, survival did not mean freedom. Even when a woman's virginity was proven, the scars remained, invisible yet unbearable. Whispered traditions spread among women, mothers advising daughters, maids instructing brides on how to endure the tests, how to stay silent, how to feign calmness when hands and eyes stripped them of dignity. These secret teachings became a form of resistance, fragile and hidden, a way of helping one another survive a system they could not openly oppose. But the cost was heavy. To be declared pure was to be marked forever as property, as a vessel for dynastic hopes. The trauma lingered. Imagine knowing that at any moment you might be summoned again, examined again, your truth questioned again. Queens who had passed their trials carried with them a lifelong terror of betrayal, that one false accusation could return them to the chamber, undo years of loyalty and obedience in a single afternoon. Their bodies no longer belonged to them. They were the currency of alliances, the foundation of treaties, the leverage in wars. Even outside the courts, ordinary women lived under the same shadow, fearing gossip, fearing accusation, fearing the shame that could end not just a marriage, but a life. And here is the bitter irony. A woman could succeed in deceiving the test. She could even prove her purity beyond doubt, and still she remained a prisoner. The system ensured that she would never escape the role assigned to her. Her worth was tied forever to an examination table, to a stained sheet, to the judgment of others. So tell me, if you had lived then, would you have fought against such chains, even knowing the price? Or would you have endured in silence, carrying the weight of fear every day of your life? Centuries have passed, yet the shadow of these practices has not disappeared. The virginity tests of queens may belong to medieval castles and candlelit chambers, but echoes of the same cruelty still resound in parts of the modern world. Even today, in certain countries, women are forced to undergo so-called virginity examinations, paraded before families, courts, or entire communities as though their dignity were a public possession. The World Health Organization and the United Nations declared in 2018 that these tests are forms of violence, with no scientific or medical basis. And yet they persist, because the logic that once stripped Joan of Arc, Catherine of Aragon, and countless nameless brides of their autonomy is not gone. It has simply changed costume. The legacy is clear. Control over women's bodies has always been about power, not purity. In the Middle Ages, it ensured dynasties, alliances, and wars. Today, it may wear the mask of tradition, morality, or family honor, but the effect is the same: to make a woman's worth depend on something she cannot control, something that should never define her humanity. The cruelty lies not only in the act itself, but in the centuries of silence that followed. Centuries where stories of humiliation were hidden behind tapestries and palaces pretended at holiness. And so we are left with a question that refuses to die. Why has this obsession with control endured for so long? If entire kingdoms once rose and fell on the judgment of a girl's body, what does it say about us that the same logic still survives in our own time? And I ask you, if history is still alive in these practices, isn't it our duty to finally end it? Or will the echo of medieval cruelty continue to whisper into the present, reminding us that the chains of the past are not so easily broken?